Wind, Sand, and Stars. Chapter 4. The Elements. When Joseph Conrad described a typhoon, he said very little about towering waves or darkness, or the whistling of the wind in the shrouds. He knew better. Instead, he took his reader down into the hold of the vessel, packed with emigrant coolies, where the rolling and the pitching of the ship had ripped up and scattered their bags and bundles, burst open their boxes, and flung their humble belongings into a crazy heap. Family treasures painfully collected in a lifetime of poverty. Pitiful mementos so alike that nobody but their owners could have told them apart, had lost their identity and lapsed into chaos, into anonymity, into an amorphous magma. It was this human drama that Conrad described when he painted a typhoon. Every airline pilot has flown through tornadoes, has returned out of them to the fold, to the little restaurant in Toulouse, where we sat in peace under the watchful eye of the waitress. And there, recognizing his powerlessness to convey what he has been through, has given up the idea of describing hell. His descriptions, his gestures, his big words would have made the rest of us smile, as if we were listening to a little boy bragging. And necessarily so. The cyclone of which I am about to speak was, physically, much the most brutal and overwhelming experience I ever underwent. And yet, beyond a certain point, I do not know how to convey its violence except by piling one adjective on another, so that in the end I should convey no impression at all, unless perhaps that of an embarrassing taste for exaggeration. It took me some time to grasp the fundamental reason for this powerlessness, which is simply that I should be trying to describe a catastrophe that never took place. The reason why writers fail in the attempt to evoke horror is that horror is something invented after the fact, when one is recreating the experience over again in the memory. Horror does not manifest itself in the world of reality, and so, in beginning my story of a revolt of the elements which I myself lived through, I have no feeling that I shall write something which you will find dramatic. I had taken off from the field at Trelew, and was flying down to Comodoro Rivadavia in the Patagonian Argentine. Here the crust of the earth is as dented as an old boiler. The high-pressure regions over the Pacific send the winds past a gap in the Andes into a corridor 50 miles wide through which they rush to the Atlantic in a strangled and accelerated buffeting that scrapes the surface of everything in their path. The sole vegetation visible in this barren landscape is a plantation of oil derricks, looking like the after-effects of a forest fire. Towering over the round hills on which the winds have left the residue of stony gravel, there rises a chain of prow-shaped, sawtooth, razor-edged mountains, stripped by the elements down to the bare rock. For 3 months of the year, the speed of these winds at ground level is up to 100 miles an hour. We who flew the route knew that once we had crossed the marshes of Trelew and had reached the threshold of the zone they swept, we should recognize the winds from afar by a gray-blue tint in the atmosphere, at the sight of which we would tighten our belts and shoulder straps in preparation for what was coming. From then on we had an hour of stiff fighting, and of stumbling again and again into invisible ditches of air. This was manual labor, and our muscles felt it pretty much as if we had been carrying a longshoreman's load. But it lasted only an hour. Our machines stood up under it. We had no fear of wings suddenly dropping off. Visibility was generally good, and not a problem. This section of the line was a stint. Yes, it was certainly not a drama. But on this particular day, I did not like the color of the sky. The sky was blue. pure blue. Too pure. A hard blue sky that shone over the scraped and barren world, while the fleshless vertebrae of the mountain chain flashed in the sunlight. Not a cloud. The blue sky glittered like a new-owned knife. I felt in advance the vague distaste that accompanies the prospect of physical exertion. The purity of the sky upset me. Give me a good black storm in which the enemy is plainly visible. I can measure its extent and prepare myself for its attack. I can get my hands on my adversary. But when you are flying very high in clear weather, the shock of a blue storm is as disturbing as if something collapsed that had been holding up your ship in the air. It is the only time when a pilot feels that there is a gulf beneath his ship. Another thing bothered me. I could see on a level with the mountain peaks, not a haze, not a mist, not a sandy fog, but a sort of ash-colored streamer in the sky. I did not like the look of that scarf of filings scraped off the surface of the earth and borne out to sea by the wind. I tightened my leather harness as far as it would go, and I steered the ship with one hand, while with the other I hung on to the longeron that ran alongside my seat. I was still flying in remarkably calm air. Very soon came a slight tremor. As every pilot knows, there are secret little quiverings that foretell your real storm. No rolling, no pitching, no swing to speak of. The flight continues horizontal and rectilinear, but you have felt the warning drum on the wings of your plane. Little intermittent rappings, scarcely audible, and infinitely brief. Little cracklings from time to time, as if there were traces of gunpowder in the air. And then, everything around me blew up. Concerning the next couple of minutes, I have nothing to say. All that I can find in my memory is a few rudimentary notions, fragments of thoughts, direct observations. I cannot compose them into a dramatic recital because there was no drama. The best I can do is to line them up in a kind of chronological order. In the first place, I was standing still. Having banked right in order to correct a sudden drift, I saw the landscape freeze abruptly where it was and remain jiggling on the same spot. I was making no headway. My wings had ceased to nibble into the outline of the earth. I could see the earth buckle, pivot, but it stayed put. The plane was skidding, as if on a toothless cogwheel. Meanwhile, I had the absurd feeling that I had exposed myself completely to the enemy. All those peaks, those crests, those teeth that were cutting into the wind and unleashing its gusts in my direction, seemed to me so many guns pointed straight at my defenseless person. I was slow to think, but the thought did come to me that I ought to give up altitude and make for one of the neighboring valleys where I might take shelter against the mountain side. As a matter of fact, whether I liked it or not, I was being helplessly sucked down towards the earth. Trapped this way in the first breaking waves of a cyclone about which I learned 20 minutes later that at sea level it was blowing at the fantastic rate of 150 miles an hour, I certainly had no impression of tragedy. Now, as I write, if I shut my eyes, if I forget the plane and the flight and try to express the plain truth about what was happening to me, I find that I felt weighed down. I felt like a porter carrying a slippery load, grabbing one object in a jerky movement that would send another slithering down, so that, overcome by exasperation, the porter is tempted to let the whole load drop. There is a kind of law of the shortest distance to the image, a psychological law by which the event to which one is subjected is visualized in a symbol that represents its swiftest summing up. I was a man who, carrying a pile of plates, had slipped on a waxed floor and let his scaffolding of porcelain crash. I found myself imprisoned in a valley. My discomfort was not less, it was greater. I grant you that a down current has never killed anybody, that the expression flattened out by a down current belongs to journalism and not to the language of flyers. How could air possibly pierce the ground? But here I was in a valley at the wheel of a ship that was 3/4 out of my control. Ahead of me, a rocky prow swung to left and right, rose suddenly high in the air for a second like a wave over my head, and then plunged down below my horizon. Horizon? There was no longer a horizon. I was in the wings of a theater cluttered up with bits of scenery. Vertical, oblique, horizontal. All of plane geometry was a whirl. 100 transversal valleys were muddled in a jumble of perspectives. Whenever I seemed about to take my bearings, a new eruption would swing me round in a circle, or send me tumbling wing over wing, and I would have to try all over again to get clear of all this rubbish. 2 ideas came into my mind. One was a discovery. For the first time I understood the cause of certain accidents in the mountains when no fog was present to explain them. For a single second in a waltzing landscape like this, the flyer had been unable to distinguish between vertical mountainsides and horizontal plains. The other idea was a fixation. The sea is flat. I shall not hook anything out at sea. I banked, or should I use that word to indicate a vague and stubborn jockeying through the east-west valleys. Still, nothing prophetic to report. I was wrestling with chaos, was wearing myself out in a battle with chaos, struggling to keep in the air a gigantic house of cards that kept collapsing despite all I could do. Scarcely the faintest twinge of fear went through me, when one of the walls of my prison rose suddenly like a tidal wave over my head. My heart hardly skipped a beat, when I was tripped up by one of the whirling eddies of air that the sharp ridge darted into my ship. If I felt anything unmistakably in the haze of confused feelings and notions that came over me each time one of these power magazines blew up, it was a feeling of respect. I respected that sharp-toothed ridge. I respected that peak. I respected that dome. I respected that transversal valley, opening out into my valley, and about to toss me God knew how violently, as soon as its torrent of wind flowed into the one on which I was being borne along. What I was struggling against, I discovered, was not the wind, but the ridge itself, the crest, the rocky peak. Despite my distance from it, it was the wall of rock I was fighting with. By some trick of invisible prolongation, by the play of a secret set of muscles, this was what was pummeling me. It was against this that I was butting my head. Before me on the right I recognized the peak of Salamanca, a perfect cone which, I knew, dominated the sea. It cheered me to think I was about to escape out to sea. But first I should have to wrestle with the gale off that peak, try to avoid its down-crushing blow. The peak of Salamanca was a giant. I was filled with respect for the peak of Salamanca. There had been granted me 1 second of respite. 2 seconds. Something was collecting itself into a knot, coiling itself up, growing taut. I sat amazed. I opened astonished eyes. My whole plane seemed to be shivering, spreading outward, swelling up. Horizontal and stationary it was, yet lifted before I knew it 1,500 feet straight into the air in a kind of apotheosis. I, who for 40 minutes had not been able to climb higher than 200 feet off the ground, was suddenly able to look down on the enemy. The plane quivered as if in boiling water. I could see the wide waters of the ocean. The valley opened out into this ocean, this salvation. And at that very moment, without any warning of whatever, half a mile from Salamanca, I was suddenly struck straight in the midriff by the gale off that peak and sent hurtling out to sea. There I was, throttle wide open, facing the coast. At right angles to the coast and facing it. A lot had happened in a single minute. In the first place, I had not flown out to sea. I had been spat out to sea by a monstrous cough, vomited out of my valley as from the mouth of a howitzer. When, what seemed to me instantly, I banked in order to put myself where I wanted to be in respect of the coastline, I saw that the coastline was a mere blur, a characterless strip of blue, and I was 5 miles out to sea. The mountain range stood up like a crenellated fortress against the pure sky, while the cyclone crushed me down to the surface of the waters. How hard that wind was blowing I found out as soon as I tried to climb, as soon as I became conscious of my disastrous mistake. Throttle wide open, engines running at my maximum, which was 150 miles an hour, my plane hanging 60 feet over the water, I was unable to budge. When a wind like this one attacks a tropical forest, it swirls through the branches like a flame, twists them into corkscrews, and uproots giant trees as if they were radishes. Here, bounding off the mountain range, it was leveling out the sea. Hanging on with all the power in my engines, face to the coast, face to that wind, where each gap in the teeth of the range sent forth a stream of air like a long reptile. I felt as if I were clinging to the tip of a monstrous whip that was cracking over the sea. In this latitude, the South American continent is narrow, and the Andes are not far from the Atlantic. I was struggling not merely against the whirling winds that blew off the East Coast range, but more likely also against the whole sky blown down upon me off the peaks of the Andean chain. For the first time in 4 years of airline flying, I began to worry about the strength of my wings. Also, I was fearful of bumping the sea, not because of the down currents, which at sea level would necessarily provide me with a horizontal air mattress, but because of the helplessly acrobatic positions in which this wind was buffeting me. Each time I was tossed, I became afraid that I might be unable to straighten out. Besides, there was a chance that I should find myself out of fuel and simply drown. I kept expecting the gasoline pumps to stop priming, and indeed the plane was so violently shaken up in the half-filled tanks as well as in the gas lines, the gasoline was sloshing around, not coming through, and the engines, instead of their steady roar, were sputtering in a sort of dot and dash series of uncertain growls. I hung on, meanwhile, to the controls of my heavy transport plane, my attention monopolized by the physical struggle, and my mind occupied by the very simplest thoughts. I was feeling practically nothing as I stared down at the imprint made by the wind on the sea. I saw a series of great white puddles, each perhaps 800 yards in extent. They were running towards me at a speed of 150 miles an hour, where the down-surging windspouts broke against the surface of the sea in a succession of horizontal explosions. The sea was white, and it was green. White with the whiteness of crushed sugar, and green in the puddles the color of emeralds. In this tumult, one wave was indistinguishable from another. Torrents of air were pouring down upon the sea. The winds were sweeping past in giant gusts, as when, before the autumn harvests, they blow a great flowing change of color over a wheat field. Now and again, the water went incongruously transparent between the white pools, and I could see a green and black sea bottom. And then the great glass of the sea would be shattered anew into 1,000 glittering fragments. It seemed hopeless. In 20 minutes of struggle I had not moved forward 100 yards. What was more, with flying as hard as it was out here 5 miles from the coast, I wondered how I could possibly buck the winds along the shore, assuming I was able to fight my way in. I was a perfect target for the enemy there on shore. Fear, however, was out of the question. I was incapable of thinking. I was emptied of everything except the vision of a very simple act. I must straighten out. Straighten out. Straighten out. There were moments of respite, nevertheless. I dare say those moments themselves were equal to the worst storms I had hitherto met, but by comparison with the cyclone, there were moments of relaxation. The urgency of fighting off the wind was not quite so great, and I could tell when these intervals were coming. It was not I who moved towards those zones of relative calm, those almost green oases clearly painted on the sea, but they that flowed towards me. I could read clearly in the waters the advertisement of a habitable province. and with each interval of repose, the power to feel and to think was restored to me. Then, in those moments, I began to feel I was doomed. Then was the time that little by little I began to tremble for myself, so much so that each time I saw the unfurling of a new wave of the white offensive, I was seized by a brief spasm of panic, which lasted until the exact instant when, on the edge of that bubbling cauldron, I bumped into the invisible wall of wind. That restored me to numbness again. Up. I wanted to be higher up. The next time I saw one of those green zones of calm, it seemed to me deeper than before, and I began to be hopeful of getting out. If I could climb high enough, I thought, I would find other currents in which I could make some headway. I took advantage of the truce to essay a swift climb. It was hard. The enemy had not weakened. 300 feet. 600 feet. If I could get up to 3,000 feet, I was safe, I said to myself. But there, on the horizon, I saw again that white pack unleashed in my direction. I gave it up. I did not want them at my throat again. I did not want to be caught off balance. But it was too late. The first blow sent me rolling over, and the sky became a slippery dome on which I could not find a footing. One has a pair of hands, and they obey. How are one's orders transmitted to one's hands? I had made a discovery that horrified me. My hands were numb. My hands were dead. They sent me no message. Probably they had been numb a long time, and I had not noticed it. That was serious. Lashed by the wind, the wings of the plane had been dragging and jerking at the cables by which they were controlled from the wheel, and the wheel in my hands had not ceased jerking a single second. I had been gripping the wheel with all my might for 40 minutes, fearful lest the strain snapped the cables. So desperate had been my grip that now I could not feel my hands. What a discovery! My hands were not my own. I looked at them and decided to lift a finger. It obeyed me. I looked away and issued the same order. Now I could not feel whether the finger had obeyed or not. No message had reached me. I thought, suppose my hands were to open. How would I know it? I swung my head round and looked again. My hands were still locked round the wheel. Nevertheless, I was afraid. How can a man tell the difference between the sight of a hand opening and the decision to open that hand when there is no longer an exchange of sensations between the hand and the brain? How can one tell the difference between an image and an act of the will? Better stop thinking of the picture of open hands. Hands live a life of their own. Better not offer them this monstrous temptation. And I began to chant a silly litany, which went on uninterruptedly until this flight was over. A single thought, a single image, a single phrase tirelessly chanted over and over again. I shut my hands, I shut my hands, I shut my hands. All of me was condensed into that phrase, and for me the white sea, the whirling eddies, the sawtoothed range ceased to exist. There was only, I shut my hands. There was no danger, no cyclone, no land unattained. Somewhere there was a pair of rubber hands, which, once they let go of the wheel, could not possibly come alive in time to recover from the tumbling drop into the sea. I had no thoughts. I had no feelings except the feeling of being emptied out. My strength was draining out of me, and so was my impulse to go on fighting. The engines continued their dot and dash sputterings, their little crashing noises that were like the intermittent cracklings of a ripping canvas. Whenever they were silent longer than a second, I felt as if a heart had stopped beating. There, that's the end. No, they've started up again. The thermometer on the wing, I happened to see, stood at 20 below zero, but I was bathed in sweat from head to foot. My face was running with perspiration. What a dance! Later I was to discover that my storage batteries had been jerked out of their steel flanges, and hurtled up through the roof of the plane. I did not know then, either, that the ribs on my wings had come unglued, and that certain of my steel cables had been sawed down to the last thread, and I continued to feel strength and will oozing out of me. Any minute now I should be overcome by the indifferences born of utter weariness, and by the mortal yearning to take my rest. What can I say about this? Nothing. My shoulders ached, very painfully, as if I had been carrying too many sacks too heavy for me. I leaned forward. Through a green transparency I saw sea bottom so close that I could make out all the details. Then the wind's hand brushed the picture away. In an hour and 20 minutes I had succeeded in climbing to 900 feet. A little to the south, that is, on my left, I could see a long trail on the surface of the sea, a sort of blue stream. I decided to let myself drift as far down as that stream. Here, where I was, facing west, I was as good as motionless, unable either to advance or retreat. If I could reach that blue pathway, which must be lying in the shelter of something not the cyclone, I might be able to move in slowly to the coast. So I let myself drift to the left. I had the feeling, meanwhile, that the wind's violence had perhaps slackened. It took me an hour to cover the 5 miles to shore. There, in the shelter of a long cliff, I was able to finish my journey south. Thereafter, I succeeded in keeping enough altitude to fly inland to the field that was my destination. I was able to stay up at 900 feet. It was very stormy, but nothing like the cyclone I had come out of. That was over. On the ground I saw a platoon of soldiers. They had been sent down to watch for me. I landed nearby, and we were a whole hour getting the plane into the hangar. I climbed out of the cockpit and walked off. There was nothing to say. I was very sleepy. I kept moving my fingers, but they stayed numb. I could not collect my thoughts enough to decide whether or not I had been afraid. Had I been afraid? I couldn't say. I had witnessed a strange sight. What strange sight? I couldn't say. The sky was blue and the sea was white. I felt I ought to tell someone about it since I was back from so far away. But I had no grip on what I had been through. Imagine a white sea, very white, whiter still. You cannot convey things to people by piling up adjectives, by stammering. You cannot convey anything because there is nothing to convey. My shoulders were aching. My insides felt as if they had been crushed in by a terrible weight. You cannot make drama out of that, or out of the cone-shaped peak of Salamanca. That peak was charged like a powder magazine. But if I said so, people would laugh. I would myself. I respected the peak of Salamanca. That is my story, and it is not a story. There is nothing dramatic in the world, nothing pathetic, except in human relations. The day after I landed, I might get emotional, might dress up my adventure by imagining that who I was, alive and walking on earth, was living through the hell of a cyclone. But that would be cheating, for the man who fought tooth and nail against that cyclone had nothing in common with the fortunate man alive the next day. He was far too busy. I came away with very little booty indeed, with no more than this meager discovery, this contribution. How can one tell an act of the will from a simple image when there is no transmission of sensation? I could perhaps succeed in upsetting you if I told you some story of a child unjustly punished. As it is, I have involved you in a cyclone, probably without upsetting you in the least. This is no novel experience for any of us. Every week, men sit comfortably at the cinema and look at the bombardment of some Shanghai or other, some Guernica, and marvel without a trace of horror at the long fringes of ash and soot that twist their slow way into the sky from those man-made volcanoes. Yet we all know that together with the grain in the granaries, with the heritage of generations of men, with the treasures of families, it is the burning flesh of children and their elders that, dissipated in smoke, is slowly fertilizing those black cumuli. The physical drama itself cannot touch us until someone points out its spiritual sense.